at Somlo in London with Daniel, and I think this is a really interesting location. So if I can just give you a brief introduction. So I grew up in London, and as a child, pre-internet, you had to come to London to buy nice things. And I remember going past Somlo, probably it must have been the late 70s, early 80s, because you've been here as a family business that long, haven't you?
We have, yeah, in the area we have been.
Yeah.
We've been here in this location since 2008 with Omega. Prior to that, we were just over the road in Piccadilly Arcades since 1970.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're very much part of the family here, and I think it's really interesting that the history that you can shed upon the way watch appreciation, let's call it that for the sake of this interview, has changed. Now, I just want to talk to you personally. So, what sparked your interest in watches?
So originally, I was actually studying architecture to be an architect.
Right.
But this was 2008, which was not a great time to
Okay.
studying to become an architect. So I initially sort of, being a family business, obviously I was around watches for quite a lot of my early life and everything like that, but I never really sort of took it on board until I came to actually work here as a young person. Just meant to be for a couple of months, help out and keep myself busy over the summer and contribute. and I it was love at first sight, really. Absolutely head over heels in love with watches and haven't looked back since.
Do you remember the first watch you ever bought or sold?
I do. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to bring to the business after falling in love with it was actual watchmaking skills. So I'm a trained qualified watchmaker.
Right, okay.
And when I was studying to become a watchmaker, I thought it would be a good time to actually buy a watch.
Right.
Try and fix it up and sell it on, and that's what I wanted to do ultimately. So it was a good sort of test. And I went, like many people, onto eBay at the time.
Okay.
Trawled around and found a 1950s Seamaster dress watch, bumper automatic, which I bought from America. Then had the startling revelation of import duties to deal with.
So you were really on your own. This was a voyage of discovery.
It was. I wanted to. I was very set in. I need to find this out. I need to learn about all of these things. I didn't even think twice about any subsequent costs or anything.
Right, okay.
Like that. But I got hold of the watch and serviced it with some help at the time, but did manage to do it as part of a sort of project at school. And and I haven't actually been able to sell it since, but so I couldn't really part with it, to be honest.
It was significant and remains significant.
Remains significant, so yeah.
So was there a moment that you realised this was for you? In other words, vintage watches were for you. Was that part of it, or was it? It become an obsession?
It was definitely when I sort of came here. I mean, the first sort of spark of interest was when I actually got as a gift my first sort of, you call it a decent watch.
Yeah.
Which was for my 18th birthday. It was right when we first started our partnership with Omega in 2008. And they had the big Omega Mania sale and this big thematic sale, which really brought up the reputation of vintage Omega, which had largely been overlooked sort of up to that period. And that was when we got established here. And I remember my father brought the big Antiquorum catalogue, 800-page tree, and he sort of plopped it in front of me and he said, "Oh, have a look at this. This is this big thing that we're doing. Look at these, and which one of these do you like the look of? What sort of sparks your interest?" And I looked at a few of them and picked out a couple, and I said, "Oh, I really like this one with the black face and the lots of white hands on it." That was the extent of my knowledge at the time. Watches.
But that's not such a bad appeal, isn't it? Because I always say, you always see that one watch and it sticks in your mind. It's like seeing a face of someone, isn't it?
Yeah,
and you go,
absolutely.
"Oh, I remember you."
It's pure aesthetics. I mean, nothing about watches, nothing about the workings. I thought that watch looked nice, and it was a Speedmaster.
Right. Okay.
And so I got, for my 18th birthday, my father very kindly bought me a Speedmaster. I think it would have been a 1999 Speedmaster. Second-hand, obviously.
Yeah.
And that was my sort of everyday watch for several years. Then afterwards, wearing this, loved it, appreciated it, wore it day in, day out, bashed it around, as a young person would do. And then but it wasn't until I actually sort of started working here that I really started appreciating what it was and the story and the history.
And if I may say, at that time, whilst it was a lovely gift, Speedmaster was still quite excessively priced. I remember for a long time thinking, actually, you get a lot of watch for a Speedmaster. You get a lot of value for that chronograph watch of that historical significance.
You do, absolutely. I mean, like everything these days, it's price, but that's sort of across the board with all watches, really. But yeah, at the time, they were always very sort of for a luxury watch.
Yes, with a real history.
With a real history. It was very easy to kind of get hold of one, and it really wasn't that sort of dear, not compared to its competitors, I'd say.
And now, after all these years, and you're now a seasoned expert, what keeps the passion alive for you? What in your daily work really keeps the interest going?
I think, something I've definitely experienced is that no matter how long, like I've been doing this now, 16 years.
Right, okay.
Which is a long time for somebody in their sort of mid-30s,
but man and boy, literally.
Of course, yeah. Something that I've very much experienced and embraced as a sort of ethos is that you are always learning. There is almost every day I've learned something new. I find out something I didn't realise or didn't know, and I think as long as you keep that in mind as a dealer and a collector, that you will never know everything, and there is always something to learn. There is always going to be people who know more than you about something, and rather than reject it or push it aside or say, "Oh, I'm not interested," just keep your ears and eyes open, and take everything in.
Yeah, I find that the history of watchmaking is labyrinthine, and you're constantly on a voyage of discovery. So, how has your philosophy about collecting changed over the years? Do you think it's changed?
Yes, definitely. Just in what I tend to wear as a daily watch, to what I sort of recommend, even what I see people coming in asking for. Back when I first started doing this, everyone was wearing 42, 44 millimeter sports watches. That was what guys wore.
Yeah.
And that was the case for a long time, and they were always the watches that commanded the premiums and what everyone kind of wanted. And I think we're still at the tail end of that. But I've certainly noticed, especially in the last few years, that I've been looking at smaller, dressier, more interesting watches rather than just sports watches. And I mean, it's certainly reflected in the sort of stock that we tend to have and what we tend to buy, and even what I tend to recommend people coming in. We're finding less and less people going for Speedmasters, Seamaster 300s. Even in the other dealers, we don't really deal in them, but Rolex sports watches even less desirable than, say, Patek Philippe dress watches, Vacherons.
And that was going to be my next question, because obviously this evolution over the past 10 years, I think, has been quite dramatic. And I think also people probably forget that a sports watch 30, 40 years ago was actually quite a small watch. Because it was sub 40 millimeters was still quite a big watch, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back that sort of period, that people didn't really wear watches that large unless they were some gaudy, glitzy Jacob's watch or something.
And also, you see some of the military watches and you see on people's wrists, and they're actually quite small. I personally wonder how they could really read them because they were that small. But you look and you see these tiny watches on people's wrists in that military role.
The key is contrast.
Right, okay,
contrast.
How interesting, yeah.
Some of the old 1940s Dirty Dozen watches, things like that, they're actually very, very easy to read, even though they're 34 millimeter watches, just because it's so stark.
Yeah, and there's a lot, I always say it's because there's a lot in the dial, the depth, the shadow, the way the hands are polished. There's a lot goes into a dial before you even talk about colour.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the new collectors that you've seen, do you think they're more knowledgeable now, or do you think they're differently informed? In other words, they have a new set of wants and desires, or do you think their knowledge base is just so much greater?
I think it's a combination. I think some people, the general knowledge base has certainly improved. The internet's helped with that.
Yeah.
But as we were discussing before, it's the problem with everyone being able to supply information about everything is there's the expression about a little knowledge is dangerous.
Yes, yeah,
And it's sort of like the Wikipedia effect, where people who really don't know what they're talking about can speak as if they do,
yeah,
and somebody will say, probably the best way to explain it is to take a specific example. And Speedmaster, there's a book on Speedmasters, a big watch only book that thick,
yeah,
all about different references, what hands go on what dials go on what bracelets go on what, everything. And it's not something you'd sit there and read for fun. It's very much a reference book. But as somebody who has read it quite a few times,
well, probably like me. I mean, I've got the old Schiffer publications about chronographs, Gerd Lang's book, and it's not an evening's read, is it? But you're constantly delving into it,
going into it. And the problem is that you can identify something like a rare feature on a watch or a nice feature on a watch and be like, oh, that's really nice, and then find a watch with that feature and think, oh, I found something rare. But because you've not got the experience and you've not necessarily, you've identified one thing when there could be a whole array of things which are completely wrong about the watch, but you've identified one rare thing and sadly there's not that many people who are ever going to correct you on it, so the misinformation is compounded. And then
I think that for me that goes with the entire watch industry, is that once we have these layers of misinformation, you're almost wrestling away the foundations that are actually totally false, but because there's so many layers of it, people see that as that's the reference work. And of course, as we discussed before the camera went on, that the industry was not taking archival records, they were manufacturing products to sell. And then
that was the priority.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as well that there's a whole other side of it, which is the motivation behind the information and the agendas. So another huge bugbear of mine is books, and that's because there's this sort of reliability that's imparted by something being in a book.
Yes.
Everyone thinks, oh, it's in a book, so it must be accurate.
Yes.
But a lot of these books were written by people who were trying to sell things in the book.
Yes.
So
the book's purpose was to sell. It was a catalogue, not an archival reference work.
Correct. And I think this is probably most prevalent in Rolex, Rolex sports watches, because from the lack of input from the parent company, Rolex are sort of notorious for not really sharing a huge amount about their archives or what they do know. I'm sure they do know a lot more than they let on.
But maybe that's because the information can be sucked out of them and then misused. Maybe that's
very possible. And I also think that as soon as they do start officially releasing information, that a lot of fakes will be exposed and the values of them second-hand and vintage watches will drop. And so there's a motivation behind everything, and a lot of the people, say, manufacturing fake dials and things like that, were the people who were publishing the books saying that the dials were real.
So it's you have, let's be honest about it. I mean, you've been here a long time. You have to go and build a relationship. That's what I was thinking. You have to see things. You have to build a relationship, and there has to be a degree of trust. Mm-hmm. And we've mentioned certain experts that we both know, that we mutually know, and those people are very much trusted. But if I may say, like Somlo, you're not shouting, we are the authoritative people. We're saying, well, we've been here for a long time. If you want to know, come and see us, come and talk to us. Do you think, we talked briefly about the market evolving and what kind of vintage pieces people are looking for now. Has that changed dramatically, do you think, over the last 5 years or the last 10 years? Because I don't know if there was a watershed after COVID or it's a gradual since 2013, 14.
I think it's been a gradual progression from sort of 2013, 2014, maybe even a little bit earlier. COVID was a sort of weird, anomalous blip. Where the entire industry kind of lost its head, and value and rarity were words that just kind of got thrown around willy-nilly, and the brands capitalized on scarcity, artificial or otherwise. And I think it's a shame, because a lot of people have been put off buying watches as a whole, because of how badly they may have been burned over the sort of frenzy of watch buying during and immediately after COVID. Case in point, the 5711 Nautilus. It was a £25,000 watch thereabouts, and it was a good watch at £25,000. But then when you see them selling for £125,000 just because people can't get hold of them, it was. I mean, we were sitting here when it was at 40,000, going, this can't continue.
So Daniel, we talked about the market changing. Do you see any signs of market fatigue, or are we just starting?
It's a difficult question, because it's so difficult to ignore the COVID blip, and to see whether that was something that's going to affect the sort of trend, or if it's just something that was a blip. I think really when you kind of remove that strange time, there is still an upward kind of trend, and I think the whole concept of vintage especially has become a lot more popular. I mean, we've certainly seen a lot more sort of vintage watch dealers popping up and people sort of buying and selling vintage.
So in terms of the bubble from post-COVID, which obviously was extraordinary in many ways, you still think there is an upward trajectory?
I think so, yes. I think, especially for vintage, I find modern's always a very volatile market, and it goes up and down with a lot of factors, because for me, modern watches, it's almost like potatoes or assets. It's they're things with a price attached to them, £5 here or there, that's what they are. Whereas with vintage, the entire concept of condition and originality and things like that comes into play. And I think as it's become more popular, you're seeing more celebrities wearing vintage watches, and, rather than just being given stuff to wear by the big brands. Even that though, the big brands are starting to give them stuff from their back catalogue, and you're seeing some more and more celebrities walking out with watches that companies have had stuck away in their vaults, and that's just more their
I
style.
also think, I mean, I'm going to slightly differ with you, and I agree with you about the potatoes analogy, but I think that when you come to look at Somlo's window, and you really should come and look at the window of Somlo, when you look in this window, you can go from the corner right down to the side of the store, and everything to me is beautiful. Right? I think everything, you may not like it might not be to your taste, but there is a certain consideration of aesthetics that I think just hits it. So I promise you, you will find something, whoever you are, that you like in this window. And I think that consideration of design, which was done almost as a norm, is now no longer there. That's my view.
Firstly, thank you. Always nice to hear you have nice stock, but no, I completely agree with you in that regard. I think people are considering watches to be less and less of a sort of status symbol, and to just wear whatever big brand, Rolex for example, as we were just talking about off camera, is kind of its own language, you know, it means nice watch. It's just the most broadly recognised thing in the watch world. But more and more people are getting a sense of individuality with what they wear, and understanding that a watch is actually like something that you want to say about yourself, and something that you actually appreciate from a design perspective. And today, so many watches are just cookie cutter copies of each other, or you know, taking sort of little snippets from wherever their design language comes from, and regurgitating it in a new dial or a new case. Whereas back when these companies did not have the name or the reputation, they had to build it. And the only way they could build it was by making, as best they could, the best watches in the world. There was a time 100 odd years ago, 120 years ago, when Patek Philippe was a much smaller name than Tiffany. So obviously the Patek and Tiffany collaboration is one of the most famous collaborations in the watch industry today. But if you look at a Patek Philippe watch retailed by Tiffany in 1920s or 1910s, chances are that most of those watches didn't even have Patek on the dial. They just had Tiffany, because nobody knew who Patek was.
I've got a watch to sell. That's what the salesman would have said. I've got watches to sell, and we make them in Switzerland. Yeah, that would have been the pitch. Well, I think that's interesting. So with the Helicon watch that we do, what we've tried to do is with a modern antidote. In other words, we try and make a watch that has all those touches, but you just wear it and don't care about it. We're never trying to be these classic pieces, but we also want a watch that has that feel of vintage. Now, on that, what advice would you give to a new collector entering the market? So I've come in here, I have, and I think there's some accessible prices here. I think you're not, you know, we won't let you in without hundreds of thousands of pounds. There are some accessible pieces here. So what advice would you give to someone who's walked and said, I want to be a collector?
I mean that's something that we've always wanted to have an entry point into the market, because a lot of people who have never bought before don't want to be spending that kind, quite understandably, don't want to be spending that kind of money on something they may not know about too much. And so I think it's important for anyone starting their sort of watch journey, if you like. I know it's a bit of a cliche term, but it really is. It's something you kind of go through. First, to decide on what sort of watch actually piques your interest. You know, don't just buy whatever you're told to buy, and sort of don't take that much sort of that many cues from people who aren't yourself. You know, if you're looking at a watch and everyone says, "Oh, this is great, this is wonderful, you need to get this," if you don't like it, then why are you bothering?
Yes.
So I think first and foremost, it has to be something that resonates with you. Then it's always worth, you know, coming into somewhere reputable, somewhere who knows what they're doing, with a bit of history, like us, humbly, but not just us. There are others out there. But having a look around, and most importantly, holding them, feeling them. It's more important with vintage than modern by 10 times, because pictures will never, however pretty they are, will never do a watch justice. Some watches look great in pictures and don't look great in real life. Some watches look great in real life, vice versa. They don't look that great in real life, but they can make them look wonderful in pictures, which is actually the worse and much more common version of that. But there are also watches which look wonderful on a stand and don't actually sit well. I mean, this is a controversial opinion, but I actually don't particularly like the Cartier Crash, because I think it's an aesthetically fascinating watch and the story is amazing, but it's, for me, not a very comfortable watch to
I've always said, and see if you agree with me, I think I'm talking on the same lines, I can have a watch on my desk, flat, and you put it on my wrist and it comes alive. There is something about a watch that has to be not just looked at, but warm. Because as you move it around, it reflects the light, you get that. It's the only thing I think where you've got that real tactility right on a sensitive part of your body around your wrist.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with you. I think they come alive in reality.
Watches were designed to be worn. They weren't designed to be shown on a plinth.
Yes.
It's something that has to be. It's like buying a car without driving it.
What's the one underrated brand or model that you think people should know more about? And I know it's a personal subject.
That's a tough question. I mean, straight jumping to mind was Omega, because I still think that they are very undervalued for considering their history and how important they were. However, there are a lot of other sort of smaller brands which are kind of faded into obsolescence a little bit, like Watchmaker, for example. They were a very, very big brand who used to manufacture the cases for Cartier, and they also made their own, and you can find a lot of Watchmaker versions of very famous Cartier watches for significantly less money than their Cartier counterparts, but exactly the same manufacturer and everything like that.
Would you carry watches like that?
We occasionally.
But is that because of the rarity? People just don't
recognize the rarity,
them.
the Cartier Association. Obviously, we have to be a little bit picky with which brands that we carry, because half of our stock is Omega, and then we just can't cater and really do justice to having too many others. So we have to pick and mix a little bit. Also, some brands are a lot easier to work with and repair and service. And being able to sell things fully serviced and guaranteed. And
Omega have always had a very good after sales situation, haven't they? I mean, I've always been told about people who've got very rare Omegas, but they don't have the box or they're missing something, and Omega will reissue that once they've seen the watch.
They can do, yeah. probably getting harder and harder these days, just because, like with everything, it was always open to abuse. And,
Yeah.
you know, people give an inch and they take a mile, but they've certainly been a lot more open to things like that than lots of other companies do.
Now, is there one piece that you personally regret selling? The one that you'd wish you'd kept?
No, there are lots.
Okay.
There are loads of them. But I mean, it's like with everything, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing. Get a decent price for it at the time, but one thing that stands out is was actually a Cartier crash.
Right.
We had a Cartier crash watch, and this would have been probably 12 years ago now, 10 or 12 years ago, and it was one of the original 1960s London crashes, which
Right.
they made very, very, very few of, and certainly fewer than 50 of them.
Right.
And something like that today is probably worth over £1 million.
Okay.
And back then, I think we may have got 40 or 50,000 for it, which was good at the time.
But I suppose you were happy to have it. I suppose you were happy to have it pass through here.
You know, it's
the London connection, but also to really see the watch.
It's very difficult being a collector and a dealer.
Yeah.
And there are so many watches, the watch I'm wearing included, where I've learnt that if there's something really, really special and that I really, really like, just keep it aside until you find a better one.
Right.
Then swap.
Okay. Okay. And what's the most common mistake a new collector can make?
Exactly what I said before, a little knowledge is dangerous. So never assume that you know as much as you think you know, or that you know everything, because there are always people who know more than you, and there are so many mistakes that can be made. And you know, when you're often parting with not small sums of money, and you're doing it based entirely on trust of whatever information is given, I think it's really important to build up a relationship with someone who does know what they're doing, so you just have an informed person to kind of guide you through these things.
And I was going to say to you, not have you ever been burned by fate, but have you spotted something that others have missed? Have you got here and you said, no, that's wrong? But always had to impart bad news to someone.
Of course. I mean, I try and avoid telling people, you know, we all, of course, get people coming into the shop saying, is my watch genuine? And you don't really want to be the person to say, like, no, it's a complete fake. And also you can get into quite a lot of trouble for saying that, just in case, you know, I get it wrong.
Yeah.
Everyone makes mistakes. But there have been some pretty diabolical ones. And sometimes when we're offered things for sale, that's when you do have to be completely honest, because I wouldn't want to sell something that's not genuine. So yeah, I think experience is a very important aspect in that. I've probably seen thousands at this point of Speedmasters, just Speedmasters. So
Yes.
I know the good, the bad. I know what a case looks like. When one of my pet hates is when dealers call a watch unpolished, and it's like saying, I've got a car which is unwashed. Unless you've owned that since it was brand new, how are you going to know? It's only been in the last 15 years where people have wanted watches not to be polished. You know, in the 1990s, if you sent your expensive watch back to the brand for a service and it came back covered in scratches and dents, you'd probably send them a very angry letter saying, why haven't you polished my watch?
Don't you think that most people who have a nice watch, a contemporary watch, would do the same? I've sent my watch for service. The service is very expensive now, or usually very expensive. What's this thing you've sent back? It's only, and that's why manufacturers have become very attuned to refurbishment in full.
Absolutely, and I think in the last few years they've definitely got a lot better at it, knowing what to do, what not to do. But there was the entire previous time when they didn't, or when people didn't want that. So that's why when you sent your expensive sports or tool watch in for a full service, they'd replace all the hands, put a nice new dial on it. They were upgrading your watch with the new latest parts for free, or as part of your service. However, subsequently, in the collector sort of area that we are now, the value of the watch is practically nothing compared to what it could have been if it's just been left, you know, warts and all and scratches on it.
So I suppose you have that dichotomy between a watch that's never been serviced, never been looked at, or one that's been cared for but has lost some of its heritage.
Exactly.
What does a typical day look like running one of London's premier vintage watch specialists? What does the day consist of?
That is a broad sort of question because days can vary greatly, as I'm sure you can imagine. But your typical day will be, we will always have somebody here on the shop floor ready to help, and customers coming to the door, ringing the bell, asking questions. Most of what we have is out around the outside of the shop so people can look before they come in, but we do have a few more special things on the inside. However, in the background, we're speaking to dealers and people in the trade who we've known about purchasing, buying things. We do some repairs and restoration for vintage Omega watches, so that needs to be dealt with. And again, I think people like to come to us because we know what not to do, if that makes sense.
You value what their possession, you value their watch, you know exactly how to
we know what would affect it badly and what's probably more important to try and keep rather than replace or clean or service. There's a trend now with watches that people like to have all of the sort of oxidization on the gold on the outside, so it goes all these blues and purples and things, which obviously if you took it in for a service they'd mostly just clean off. But now it shows that the watch hasn't been touched for a very long time. It's all sort of unpolished aspect.
So do you do a lot of the watch servicing yourself? So if I bought a watch from you, would I bring it back to you here?
Anything that's bought from us, we will always service going forward, and we will have service prior to selling it.
Right.
That's something that's.
And you do that all in-house?
All in-house, or well, we have an external workshop who were our watchmakers prior. Now they are independent, but they still do a lot of.
But you've got a long relationship with them, so you know exactly what's expected of each other.
We sent them all to watchmaking schools. So,
okay. And this may be a different question because I think it's probably more relevant, maybe even you can perceive. But how do you see your role or Somlo's role in preserving watch history? Because you talked about a partnership with Omega.
Yeah.
That came back. So how do you see your role in that?
I mean, without meaning to sort of overstate our importance in the wider kind of the wider arena of watch collecting, I think we've definitely shown our value in raising awareness of vintage Omega. I think prior to the big sale and our sort of establishment, I think they were very much an overlooked brand, potentially because of the quantity of watches they produced. I mean, everyone has an old Omega knocking around in a drawer, which was their fathers, their uncles, and their grandfathers. And the wonderful things about these watches is that more often than not, they take it out from the drawer, wind it up, and it's working.
Yes.
So they were very reliable, good watches, and that's something that we were very keen to kind of push the fact. You go back to the 50s and 60s before Rolex were ever anything like what they are today, and Omega was the watch to have. Omega was the watch that everyone bought, and they were some of the best in the world. The Omega Constellation, for example, now is a very, very different watch to what it was when it was first introduced in 52. Back then it was their flagship watch. It was the most accurate, most sort of high-end movement. It was the most expensive watch in the range. Significantly more expensive than a Speedmaster, than sort of gold ones and things like that. A different league.
Well, I think also people, and tell me if I'm wrong because you are the expert, but all the Speedmasters and the Seamasters, they were literally instruments.
They were tool
watches. I mean, as far as I understand, there was an air, land, and a sea collection. And all of those weird and wacky things like the plop prof and things. They were designed to sell as a proper instrument to the professional.
You would not have bought a watch like that because you liked the way it looked.
Yeah.
Because it was fashionable. That's not a thing. You bought a Speedmaster because you needed to time things. You bought a Seamaster because you were a diver. You bought a Railmaster very, very briefly because you were maybe a doctor walking around magnets or a big locomotive which has a big magnet in it. But then anti-magnetic watches became more popular and that became a bit redundant. So
yeah. Well, all these technologies evolved, didn't they, in that one particular brand?
Yeah. But it was sort of industry-wide. nobody would have bought a tool watch. That was why it's called a tool watch, because you bought it because it was a tool.
Yes.
Whereas dress watches, and they were just watches. The very first Seamasters were dress watches, but they were your go anything, do anything, go anywhere, do anything watch, and they don't look anything like a tool watch.
Yeah, exactly. Now, is there one story, one watch, or one lesson that sums up your journey so far? It's a complicated question, but I'm saying, is there one particular thing that's happened you thought that really cements what we do, that typifies what we do well?
That's a tough one. I can't think of one particular instance, but I can say what the most sort of enjoyable things to do to sort of sell. And we talked earlier about how we always have like a part of what we do which is on the more accessible kind of side, and that tends to be the sort of Omega dress watches, the steel ones, and the sort of 50s and 60s sort of more basic watches, and they are often bought by people who are quite new to this,
right? Because
they tend to be at a lower price point than the Patek and Vacheron and Rolex equivalent, and they are all so different. I mean, it's very rare to find two identical of the same thing, because they would have had a bunch of dials, a bunch of hands, and a bunch of cases, and just mixed and matched all together. And so there's so much individuality there, and because a couple of £1,000, of course it's not a small amount of money, especially when you're buying your first kind of watch, but then you really pour your heart and soul into it. And so many people come in, I want to buy a nice dress watch for my wedding, or I want to buy this, I've just graduated, or finished university and I want a nice watch, and parents want to buy me a nice watch, and they tend to be so much more meaningful than, oh, I've got this very rare Patek Philippe reference which is £50,000-60,000 and it's a first series XYZ. That's just a collector who's bought lots of these watches and knows what they're looking at. It's nice, thank you very much for sourcing it, such a beautiful watch. Whereas the other, you're contributing to a major point in their lives.
And I think isn't that the beauty of watches, in terms of it, forgive the pun, but it is marking the moment in time. You will never forget that gift of a watch, which was for a wedding, for an engagement, for a graduation, for a birthday, for a coming of age present. And that's why I think we all love watches, because whatever it is, you'll never forget that original watch.
Yeah, those are definitely the most meaningful sort of things for me.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you very much.
No problem.
Great interview.
Thank you.
So it's been really interesting. As I said, I've walked past Somlo for years and really admired the watches, so it's great to be in here and bring Somlo and all their expertise to everyone's attention. So thank you very much.
No problem at all. Nice to do this.
Thank you.